No, Pallas doesn't have the strongest guard skill and nor is she game breaking. As starters, this is not an attack on Dreamy in any fashion, although I do think that her video is incredibly misleading on Pallas' worth. The video will mainly cover Pallas' skill 1 and skill 3, as it's generally accepted that skill 2 is the least widely used one and not particularly great. Pallas' skill 1, if looking purely at numbers, is made out to be a fairly good guard skill and touted as a Thorns skill 3 without any wind-up, which at a surface level examination can seem to be true. Outright using that as a response on if Pallas is worth pulling for, though, is pretty damning given the many restrictions on her kit and how far she falls without the most optimum of conditions. Her two major conditions to satisfy Thorns level DPS is to be not blocking a target and having to be above 80% health. The second condition essentially forces her to either be laning a low pressure lane or to have another unit in front of her. Let's take a minute to think about how ridiculous these conditions are in the context of a kit as a purely solo unit. If you have either or both Blaze and Thorns, you'll know that range is one of the biggest disparities between them, and practically only Thorns can stop an enemy before it reaches him. The first condition of Pallas is similar to having Blaze not be blocking anything, which is, well, unoptimal, and sure, the argument applies that Pallas can kill certain enemies before it reaches her, but then you'll be dealing with basic trash wherein DPS doesn't really matter. If you're facing off against any enemy with a basic degree of tankiness and difficulty, Pallas will not be able to do shit the 2 tiles where her DPS is optimal, and then her DPS plummets when said enemy touches her, and one hit drops her below 80% health, rendering her DPS pitiful. If you think I'm talking about some sort of fantastical elite mob seen in EX stages, I'm really not. See this video by Tsulatsu on Pallas vs 2 loggers, which are common enemies seen in chapter 1 and chapter 2, and you'll see that she struggles quite a bit. Now let's up that logger to a unit that you might see in common endgame content like an armed militant, which is seen in say LS5. It takes roughly 3 to 4 seconds to reach her, and in that time, sure, she can dish out around 5.5k damage, and that takes it down to around 6k health, where it then just needs one hit to easily take her below 80% health, disabling both of her conditions. And what does she get when she's facing a 700 defense enemy like that? Well, besides getting utterly fucked, her DPS drops to a whooping 500, which at best is unimpressive considering that Thorns in the exact same situation has around 1.5k DPS. Now, from my previous paragraphs, it may seem like Pallas is pretty bad, but that's only in the context of her being a solo unit, or lane holder as the cool kids call it these days. She easily fulfills both of her job conditions if there's any unit in front of her, and paired with her defender she does do her job pretty well, but still generally loses out to Blaze and Sarah in that regard. Pallas is not a Mustima level unit, don't get me wrong, but using her in the same situations where a solo lane holder is applicable is some serious copium. Without a supporting blocker, she generally cannot function to anywhere near the level of effect as other ones, and the only thing she has going for her is the 0 activation time, which I admit is fairly nice. I do need to mention that Kelstead S2 requires 2 deployment slots though, and she functions nicely as a lane holder, so the Pallas needs 2 deployment slots schmick isn't something that ruins her, but don't expect the same level of performance from her as say, Thorns. So for Pallas skill 1 in particular, she falls off greatly in comparison to other lane holders due to the conditionals being impossible to fulfill against any sort of tougher enemy. It's a usable skill if you manage to find a good spot for her paired with a blocker, or if it's a lower pressure lane that she can either burst enemies down before reaching her, or tank them while dishing out lower DPS, but by no means is it even close to being the strongest guard skill available. Now onto Pallas skill 3, which some might compare to Mountain skill 3, Silverish skill 3, or Bagpipe skill 3. On paper, again, it does seem fairly promising, assuming optimum conditions. I must sound like a broken record here, but it is the crux of this video, and what everything stems from. Looking at this chart from Victor Lab, we have decent numbers on skill from Pallas, which is in the range where you're going to use her, being pretty similar to Bag and Mountain. I'll give you that, but again the issue of practicality comes into play. When paired with a blocker, the skill can dish out decent amounts of DPS, but it also doesn't give the 50% figure buff to herself. Without a blocker, the skill takes a DPS hit similar to skill 1, but it's much harder to justify a blocker on what some people tout as a heli drop DPS burst skill. It's still a usable skill, however looking at it in the context of newer players, they'll prefer consistent DPS of skill 1, and to older players the amount of burst they have generally outclasses the skill in all aspects. Some examples being Bag offering starting SP, Mountain being able to shift cancel dangerous enemies, and Silverash having ludicrous range. There's just not a ton of reason to choose this skill in the saturated card burst market, and the conditional non-health drop nature of it further dissuades its use. In the context of a solo burst skill, it's still really easy to remove its conditionals and then it becomes really underwhelming, although not degrading as fast as skill 1. Generic doesn't mean bad though, and you can certainly find some decent applications with it. If it means anything, the general consensus in CN is that her more applicable skill is also skill 1, and that Pallas skill 3 isn't really close to the other bursts in terms of usability. Overall, I'll place Pallas middle of the pack in terms of general usage, but very low for any type of CC content since she wouldn't flourish given the stat checks. She's by no means the trash Chantier unit that NGA makes him out to be, nor the possessor of the strongest single target guard skill, which is more comical. Somewhere in the middle, but definitely leaning towards the former. I wouldn't pull for him if you have Thorns, and if you don't have Thorns, you might as well just wait for his dedicated raid up during CC6, which is right after the losses.